Hello and welcome to this expert discussion today on the EU microplastics scandal. My name is Maeve Campbell. I'm the Deputy Editor of Euronews Green and I will be your host. Today we will pose the questions: will Europe take the lead in the fight against microplastics? And what does a comprehensive EU microplastics ban look like? Now, firstly, I'd like to introduce you to our expert panel. Firstly, we have Bentelise Kraaijeveld, who is from Plastic Soup Foundation. Bentelise comes from a political science background where she specialises in environmental policy and particularly marine governance. She is now an advocacy officer working on the issue of microplastic pollution from cosmetics and plastic regulation on both an EU and national level. Secondly, we have Professor Hans-Peter Arp, who works at the Department of Environmental Chemistry at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU. Hans-Peter's research is related to pollutants in the environment and in particular microplastics. He designs solutions within the context of both emerging technologies and policy mechanisms such as REACH, which I'm sure you all know, the European regulation on registration, evaluation, authorization and restriction of chemicals, all with the aim to create a zero pollution society. Thirdly, we've got Martin Hojsik, who is an MEP from Renew Europe Group. In the European Parliament, he focuses on chemical policies and the circular economy alongside climate finance. Martin is a member of the European Parliament Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, and he's previously led national and international campaigns against toxic substances and waste at Greenpeace. Fourth, we have Hélène Duguy, who is a law and policy advisor at Client Earth. Hélène has a specialism in EU environmental regulatory issues, including sustainable product policy and chemical pollution. Hélène is specifically involved in matters relating to the implementation of the main EU chemicals regulation, REACH. And Dr. David Green, lastly, is the director at the Centre for Marine and Coastal Zone Management at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. David's specialism is in the application of geospatial technologies to marine and coastal environments. He has published a number of books and he is a member of AGI Scotland, which runs the coastal partnership Turning the Plastic Tide. So thank you for coming, everyone. And before we start, I will just give you all a bit of background on what we're discussing today. So shocking new research has found that almost 9 in 10 products from major cosmetics brands contain microplastics. More than 7,000 products from household names were investigated, and of those brands, only 13% were found to be free from microplastics. The EU is set to introduce new restrictions on the addition of microplastics to cosmetics, as well as detergents, agricultural products, and others. But this is due to be based on the European Chemicals Agency, known as ECHA, and their definition of microplastics, which excludes the majority of synthetic polymers. In fact, the current proposal covers just 4% of microplastics in cosmetics. So why does this matter? Every single minute, over 7 kilos of microplastics end up polluting the environment. And if we took the even broader definition, that would be at least 25 times more. Not only do microplastics stay in the environment for hundreds of years, they are also damaging for human health as we ingest them unknowingly. Recently, they were even found in human blood for the first time. So the upcoming legislation only tackles a fraction of the problem. We're here to talk about how and why the EU restrictions should be all-encompassing if we want to protect Europe, the environment, and its people. So we'll start with our panel discussion and then move on to questions from the audience. And when we do get there, if you could state your name and the company you're from with the question in the Q&A function on Zoom, that will really help the panel with their responses. So first of all, the first question I'd like to pose is, how can Europe lead the fight against microplastics? And what would a comprehensive ban in the EU look like?
Yes, so thanks very much, Maeve, and thanks everybody for being here. I will start this off. Bentelise from Plastics Foundation, as Maeve already mentioned. So I would like to say that, first of all, I'm very happy that the European Commission is working on this important issue, because it's a very high time that we do something about this ongoing form of microplastic pollution. And the restriction is first of its kind, and it will be a pathway for other countries to follow. But therefore, it's very important to do this right. And at the moment, we are worried that the scope of this restriction will be very limited, and many synthetic polymers will actually not be included, despite the environmental concerns that exist for these polymers. And we also worry about possible long transition periods that will allow this form of pollution to go on for many more years. So it is a very good opportunity for future-proof restriction and to deal with this form of pollution once and for all. But we need to do it right. So yeah, please jump in, whoever wants to add to this.
Yeah, well, I think I can come in after that. And I first want to say also thanks for this invitation. It's a pleasure to speak today on this important topic. And yeah, so I think you brought up two things in the introduction. There's the ECHA definition of microplastic, which is in the final stages of discussion, and what that what kind of materials that encompasses, but all the broad types of polymers and synthetic polymers that doesn't encompass, and which we know actually less about. But first, we'll just talk about the ECHA definition of microplastic, which are, I think, what most people think about microplastic. These are just small bits of plastic, pretty much, that are insoluble. I think the actions that's going now is, of course, a very positive step, and we need to take first steps to get the momentum going. And it's very clear in this case that a lot of these plastics are not used for very important things. I mean, they're used for things like exfoliation or texture or things like this, and they're not necessary. There's substitutes that are more benign for human health and the environment. But we know we have to start somewhere to get this thing going. And then at the same time, I think we can expand this conversation later to other synthetic polymers that we need more information about. There's a, as you said, 25 times bigger than this issue, but we need to keep that going and keep the momentum going forward. And I think a lot of the talk about that will reflect the talk that's going in the chemical regulations now, when they're talking about are hazardous substances essential or not. And so I think when we look at, say, these soluble polymers or things that aren't covered, or dissolvable polymers, it'll be a question of, is this essential for the product or not? And that's where I think the ban will go into the next stage after the ECHA bans right now. Yeah. So yeah, anybody want to take over from that?
Let me try. So no, thank you for the invitation. This is a discussion which I was hoping that we will see a bit more progress by now. Being one of the things wasn't mentioned in my introduction, or maybe I just overheard. I'm the European Parliament's contact person with ECHA, meaning I'm quite a bit in a contact with the team at ECHA and the microplastic restrictions next to, the whole restriction roadmap, CLP review of the REACH and all the other things have crossed my desk. And there are challenges in how do we do it. I'm looking forward to discuss it a bit later. But the one disappointing thing for me, honestly, and it's not disappointment towards ECHA, it's disappointment that we are again at the situation where this is not a new problem. This is not something that, we are suddenly waking up as emerging threat. And yet, somehow the industry hasn't started to act properly. For me, it was, the research showing how much microplastics are in cosmetics is shocking and a very disappointing, because, when you hear microplastics, is all kind of, okay, it's the washing of the sports goods and the microplastics from the synthetic fibers that break off when, your fleece jacket is washed and and stuff like that. And these are problems we need to look away to address. But this is ultimately about how essential for the society is to have a microplastic exfoliant in a cosmetic product. And honestly, I find even, maybe because I don't use exfoliant on my skin, which you can see, I found this question almost ridiculous even to contemplate. And it goes down to the heart of debate, what we gonna have, and where there's gonna be a big discussion with the different stakeholders, from scientists to industry to NGOs, about what is actually essential use and how we're gonna address what is essential use. Is a particular shade of red essential? Because, if it is, then it might be toxic. And I just made up the color, but these are the changes. Then you think, like, really? What is creating the well-being and prosperity in the society when the essential use for exfoliant is suddenly everywhere around us, in our blood, in the water we drink, and becoming a very handy carrier for lots of the hazardous chemicals, including endocrine disrupting chemicals, so, gender benders. So yeah, one side, it was well said, one side is how we build the restriction, but it's not the end, it's the start of a journey, or actually, a part of a bigger journey of how do we really turn it into circular and fitting within the planetary limits. And that's ultimately what the game is about. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Martin. Yeah. David, please come in.
Okay, no, yeah, these are all very important things. And again, thank you very much for inviting me along. I think the whole problem of plastics is really, really serious, I think, and the volume of plastic that's in the environment now. And I'm just thinking from our own practical standpoint of a project in Scotland, that since March, we've collected 1.84 tons of marine litter off a couple of beaches. And the large majority of that is plastic. What we don't know very much about is beyond the physical appearance of plastic and cleaning the beaches, which is improving. We don't actually know what's happening with many of these plastics that are actually in the environment. They're either getting buried or are getting washed into the sea, and particularly microplastics have become something that I think have almost crept upon us very, very quickly, and you find them in products where you would not expect to find plastics. And I can vouch for that, because I came across a hand gel that I purchased in North America that was full of microplastics, these little plastic beads in it, which I was really surprised by. But I think it's a very difficult thing to deal with in many respects. And I think we really have to look at the science and use the science to back the policy. And I think given the fact that we don't know that much about where microplastics end up and how they decay, it is really something that does need to be dealt with very quickly, because there's a vast amount of plastic already in the sea, and we need to find out how much of this is going to lead to further problems. So it's a serious issue, I think. And I saw in the chat somewhere that somebody mentioned nanoplastics as well, which is another problem.
Yeah, well, it's a very big issue, isn't it? And Hélène, would you like to add anything from a legal perspective here?
I think my colleague panelists have said quite a lot. Just wanted to add that here we're talking about the restriction targeting the most preventable source of pollution. We were talking about intentionally added microplastics. So meaning, there is an intention to put these microplastics in product in the first place. And on top of the debate on essential use, which is currently being developed by the Commission, There is the issue of alternatives, which are available in most cases. And this is something that RAC and SEAC at ECA have really dealt with in depth. And I think this is the most important part of the discussion that is oftentimes left aside, that there are alternatives. So let's not pretend that we cannot replace those microplastics to the extent that they need to be replaced, of course. And the last point is, of course, as Martin highlighted, there hasn't been a lot of progress on this debate. It's been more than a year now that we've been waiting for a proposal from the Commission. So also on a legal perspective, it's quite disappointing. And on our side, we've been also working to push for something to happen so that there are meaningful debates happening also at member state level. And yeah, so that's what I can say on that. Thank you, Maeve.
Thanks, Hélène. And just moving on to the next question now, which is more about the assessment and the examination side. So with academics and campaigners concerned about the impact of microplastics on the environment and particularly on human health, how vital is it for synthetic polymers to be examined for their potential harm before they're allowed in products on the European market?
Yeah, I think Hans has a lot to say about this as well. I can start maybe from me. So we already mentioned it, but there's obviously a lot of indications that plastic are harmful for the environment and possibly also to human health. So there is enough evidence to be worried. So I think it's incredibly important that policies that are being made are based on a precautionary principle, so that the environmental and human health are being ensured. So the hazard of all synthetic polymers should be considered when developing new regulatory measures. And a way to do this is to include all synthetic polymers under REACH, because then they will be tested for their environmental and human health hazards before they can be put on the market. And at the moment, this is not the case. And we're worried that these synthetic polymers will still in huge amounts will still be able to be put on the market without us really knowing what they do to us and the environment. And now I pass the stick on to Hans.
No, but thanks, Bentelise. No, and yeah, and it was the things like polymers and synthetic polymers were always outside the scope of, I think, regulation historically, and then therefore also what scientists were interested in. I mean, synthetic polymers are excluded from the REACH regulation, which is Europe's most ambitious and one of the world's most ambitious chemical regulations, and polymers got a free pass. And then with the concern about microplastic and plastic growing, then people got more concerned about polymers, and then they focus on, what they think are plastics, these small bits of polyethylene or polystyrene or what have you. But there's a huge space of polymers that fall in between what we think of plastics and what are chemicals. And these have been really off the radar, like the dissolvable polymers, the liquid polymers. And the only time they kind of came up in the past for their concerns is when they would cause a chemical effect. A famous example was polyacrylamide, dissolvable polymer being used a lot, and sometimes the early versions of polyacrylamide used in cosmetics and also in different fields would release acrylamide, its monomer, which was a neurotoxin, and then they had to figure out how to remove that chemical threat. But they still wasn't much research of what are the long-term threats of the actual polymer itself. And we know that from the production volume that the market for all of these chemicals is really, or synthetic polymers, is taking off because they're finding more and more uses for them. And part of the reason they're taking off is because they're undergoing less regulatory scrutiny. So I think it's something that it just got past everybody. It just found this blind spot in the precautionary principle and found its way in. And so now I think regulators and scientists, of course, too, will have to figure out how to look at these and study these And to be frank, we don't really have the tools to measure them in the environment or in human blood. I can tell you a good method to measure polyacrylamide in human blood, even though I know it's used in cosmetics. We don't have these techniques yet, and they have to be developed at the same time. We have to have more of a precautionary policy by, for example, an expansion of REACH or something else that broadens the definition of what type of synthetic polymers we include, because that's where we have to go next, I think. But maybe I said enough, and I'll let other people jump in.
Thanks, Hans-Peter. And Martin, maybe you could tell us a bit about your understanding of this blind spot in relation to REACH.
The essential use, you mean? Sorry for that.
In terms of the smaller particles that haven't been included in the ECHA definition.
Well, what we see as a problem in the draft consideration, or what I think it's the challenge in the draft consideration of the restriction as far the last version I saw from ECHA, is that when you look at it, it's kind of misses lots of the smaller particles. It's can even say, the size for microplastic is too big as a threshold, and nanoplastics, it's kind of not there. And this is from a point of view of what we need to ensure in terms of protection, health, and environment, indeed something which is a challenge. Having said that, and I discussed this with ECHA informally, and one of the reasonings was that the problem is that it's not about whether these smaller particles are not a problem or shouldn't be addressed or anything. It was around the availability of the methods for detection. So kind of how much, and that's a scientific challenge we face, how much we are actually able to create where it makes sense to create a restriction that it's very hard to enforce because the authorities don't have the tools to do that. So to try to kind of compare it, you would have a situation where you have a speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour. No, that's a better example. I was trying to, but we'll go the other way. But essentially, if you cannot enforce it, if you don't have the tools to check it, it's hard to do the restriction because it's virtually unenforceable. And I see the point. I agree with it. I would like us to find a way how we can nevertheless create a space for more ambition, because these nanoplastics are being intentionally added in a smaller sizes. So we have a bit of an issue where there are plastics, there are microplastics, nanoplastics in the products that are intentionally added that the authorities cannot properly check. And I think it's a bit of a ridiculous situation. So yes, we need this step forward from ECHA in terms of having the proposal final on table. This is something which I'm expecting the Commission, especially now, to kind of move forward in a speedier form, but immediately start working with how we can address this loophole. I would be at the moment I'm inclined to say, like, it doesn't make sense to delay it and kind of rework it and hope that we'll have something better. We need to work, we need to have this first step and then immediately start working on the improvement. And hopefully, I would also hope that we can see from the industry a shift as well. I'm not a believer that in voluntary commitments solving it all, but I'm a believer in voluntary commitments helping to show the way on what is possible. And I think this is where, they can show, look, there is, possibility to do it without it. My shampoo is at least claiming to be without microplastics. I'm not going to say the brand, but we can talk off the record afterwards and you can tell me if you found anything there.
Thanks. And Hans-Peter, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the point that Martin raised about lack of enforceability, for instance, due to lack of methods, and that is a huge issue. Like nanoplastics has been raised in the chat, and dissolvable polymers we could also put there because they fall into this really space with that's really difficult to analyze. Like we have techniques for chemicals, and we have techniques for large particles. We have it's really difficult to find out what's going on in this nanoscale. It's almost impossible. That's the scale of proteins and macromolecular chemistry, and it's really hard to untangle that jungle. And I think that's something that also has to be considered, because we wouldn't have the option of, say, using monitoring regulations like the Drinking Water Directive or the Water Framework Directive if we don't have methods to actually measure the concentration that are easy. And so really the only chance we have to regulate them is at the chemical regulation. And it's a question that we have to put to producers. I mean, do you want to put a chemical in your shampoo that you suspect might be persist in the environment, in human blood for a long time, and you have no idea how to measure that? Like, is this something like, I mean, just the fact that it's not measurable is, to me, rings an alarm bells, particularly if it's persistent. And I think that and chemical regulations / polymer regulations are the only way we have to enforce anything about these, because we can't monitor them. Yeah.
Thank you. And just moving on to another question, which focuses more on just the definition, so we can make it clear to everyone what exactly all these different types actually mean. So ECHA's definition of microplastics is likely to see the exclusion of plastic particles smaller than 0.1 micrometers and water-soluble, liquid and biodegradable polymers too. So they're going to be excluded from the restrictions on microplastics in cosmetics. So the question is, how urgent is a radical rethink of this definition to include all synthetic polymers? And if anyone would like to maybe explain more about what exactly water-soluble, liquid and biodegradable polymers are and why they are just as important.
Oh, well, yeah, I guess I can start again. But well, first of all, I would not want the fact that this definition is not all-encompassing to be a hurdle, because I feel like we have to draw a line somewhere so we can start moving, but know that the definition could be modified later. I mean, so I'm very comfortable with working with the current definition as a starting definition to see where it goes rather than delay the process. But yeah, but what's not included, yeah, let's talk about dissolvable polymers. These are just like the name suggests. So you put them in water and they dissolve. And I mean, if you know what a polymer looks like, it's this long extended chain of the molecules, atoms. They have more pluses and minuses on them, so they kind of fall open and they dissolve in water. And these are used in a lot of different things. You can use them, for instance, to control the viscosity or the thickness or the texture of a cosmetic. They're used a lot also in oil and gas industry, because then they can control the texture of the fluid that they're drilling. This is one example. That's a dissolvable polymer. Liquid polymers, as the name suggests, everything melts at a certain temperature, and some things melt at room temperature. A very common one is dimethicone, PDMS. It's used in a lot of cosmetics. It's just a liquid silicone oil. So that's also falling outside the regulation, I believe. And there are some studies that we know that certain dimethicones are hazardous to marine life. So this would be also falling out of the definition. So these are things that we would have to look into. But as I said, we have no tools. So it's a research frontier, but also a policy frontier. But we do know for sure that they're being produced and used in increasing volumes.
And just coming on the non-chemical side, and thanks to the implications, and it's actually quite scary to keep on learning on where everywhere this is being kind of secretly use, and you think that silicone oil is oil, and actually no, it's a soup of lots of little noodles. My kids like noodles, but I don't think this type would be suitable. Just a bit, because when you mentioned the nano, this is where, as a parliament, we called on the Commission in the own initiative report from back in, July 2020, 2 years ago, that this is something which needs to be addressed. This is something that needs to actually happen. And not much really has. And second, in terms of the original, actually, the microplastic restrictions, when I posed with some colleagues, written a question to Commissioner Breton, and got the answer, the latest answer now, and it was similar to the answer from the question from a year ago, was that it's, it's a long-standing priority, which is nice to have a long-standing priority where the proposal is long overdue and it's delayed without any explanation why. And this is the bit sad thing that, we know that this is a problem. Yes, it's a priority to deal with it, but we're not dealing with it. And why this whole thing is happening, I wish I knew. The REACH committee meeting, which will be in a week's time, it has the microplastic restriction on the agenda, but only as an update. So there's not going to be any discussion what's the latest proposal from the Commission side, and I think this is, to put it mildly, a bit disappointing. And I'm hoping that the Commission can just start acting on it, and that we can finally see to the curtain where the problems are. And if you say like, okay, there are microplastics in certain parts of the industry intentionally used, we need to keep them using for this and that reason, let's talk about it. But there are, I would say, a lot of the microplastics that are used in a non-essential way, unless, I'm really sensitive in my skin, I want it really scrubbed only with very, small microplastics, which I believe we can live without. So action is really, really called for.
It's interesting, I think, to see how much the plastics have crept into not just everyday use, but also cosmetics and stuff. And I often wonder why we actually need these things in the first place, given that we didn't have them at one point in time. But also, I think rather worryingly as well, what Hans said about the lack of tools in order to monitor and find out what is happening is, and the uncertainty of what is happening with microplastics and nanoplastics and just the general breakdown of plastics in the environment is surely a good enough reason to put the brakes on a little bit, because this is a much bigger scale problem than even things such as agricultural chemicals and so on in the soil, which we now know have done immense damage, and we've pulled away from some of that. But it seems really worrying that these, through a lack of, I suppose, understanding, perhaps knowledge, the fact that we've just found a new product to use and we found lots of uses for it, that we aren't being a little bit more careful now that we know what happens to microplastics and where they are actually ending up through scientific research. And that surely should be enough to convince governments to put a stop on some of the production of these and the use of them, and find some alternatives that are much more long-term sustainable than just allowing these plastics to creep into the environment. And I think when you look at coastal management and so on from the past, we've always tended to think that the marine environment is somewhere it's out of sight, out of mind. It just ends up in there and it flushes away and everything's happy and it all disappears. But it's quite clear now that many of these things that we are using and increasingly using, and seems to be growing more and more every day, despite some of the bans, it seems really worrying to me that we're having this impact on the environment. It's finding its way into so many aspects that are crucial to human life, basically.
That's really worrying. And can I bring you in here, Bentelise?
Yes. Just the points that was mentioned before by Martin, I think about the delay of the proposal. I think Hélène will have some things to say about that, but it's definitely an interesting point to talk about. But just about the exemptions that we are worried that will be made. As mentioned before already, we have a lot of worries, we have a lot of concerns, but there's so many knowledge gaps that at the moment it is we can't ignore this. And also a worry that I have, that we have as Public Supernation as well, is that if we exclude or if we make all these derogations, that there will be regrettable substitutions, because industry will be able to, you know, move from solid particles to liquid, soluble, smaller particles, and we don't know what, at the moment, we don't know enough about that, but we have concerns. So I think that is something that can happen if we exclude so many of these groups. And also what we also mentioned before, if there already are better alternatives, for instance, with personal care products, why do we still exclude all these groups if we don't necessarily need to? And, you know, we really create a problem for the future if we regulate such a limited group of synthetic polymers and exempt all the other kinds that make up a majority of synthetic polymers, at least used in cosmetics in this case. So that's kind of what I wanted to add, and then I'll pass it on to Hélène.
Hélène, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Just to come back on what Bentelise said, just want to mention that, you know, it has already happened in the past that companies' behavior changed, that companies operated a sudden shift in production to adapt to new market demands. We saw it during the COVID, actually. So it's possible. It's just a matter of willingness, especially when it's easy to do. I saw there was a question in the chat on alternatives. I can actually refer you back to the RAC and SEAC opinions, which go into the details of the available alternatives, including the Annex 15 report from ECHA. Actually, the opinions of the committees are really going also towards making a restrictive and not a permissive restriction. And RAC especially, so the Risk Assessment Committee, is really pushing towards a restrictive definition of microplastics, including nanoplastics, excluding biodegradable polymers, which have no real and defined reliable criteria on which we could identify them. So it's actually based on like European scientific committees, which are there to do that, actually say so. So I think the Commission has all the background work they need to do to go to the next step. Now regarding the delay, well, we recently published with other organizations a reaction on this, because it's starting to become a bit of a joke, in the sense that, you know, this is not only a problem, but it's also illegal, because, you know, they have obligations under REACH, but also under fundamental EU treaties, under the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. They have to ensure good administration and be open and transparent. If there is a delay and this delay is justified, well, explain to us why. And as Martin said, I think there needs at one point to be an open discussion on what are the issues.
Thank you. And Martin, would you like to just finish this off? We have to move on to a new question, but please do conclude on this point.
I just one note to David said. What shocked me recently in terms of where the microplastics are also used, when you mentioned the different types of pollution, it's something where it's not going to end up in oceans so soon, but it's going to end up much sooner in our food chain, and that's pesticides. I haven't been aware, but it's massively used as an additive or as a kind of a substance, so one of the substances in the mixtures in the plant protection products, which is very worrying, because it's ending up in soil, it's ending up in our food chain in a very rapid system, and you know, it's very handy to carry all the hazardous chemicals directly into our food.
I think that actually leads on very nicely to our next question. Maybe you can talk a bit more about that. The last question from me is, what are the real day-to-day implications if the European Commission fails to address the scourge of microplastics? So what are the day-to-day implications? Would anyone like to start?
I start again.
Mm.
So yeah, what we also, I mean, there's more implications, but we have mentioned already quite a lot. But what has not been mentioned is that, and that's also something we mentioned in our report, is that it kind of sets the way for greenwashing in a way that there will be a definition of microplastics, and it might be very narrow. So, but we already have companies saying, oh, there is no microplastics in our products because we follow the ECHA definition, and these and these and these polymers are not part of that definition, or at least not in this form, etc. So what we are worried about is that there will be labels such as microplastic free and biodegradable ingredients on certain products, especially in cosmetic products. But actually, we are saying, no, it's not true, because you're still using them, but they just fall out of the scope at the moment. But we're still very worried about them. So it's even more, it's already very difficult for consumers to see what's actually in their products. And now there's actually going to be, or there might be claims like microplastic free on a shampoo or on a face cream, while it's actually maybe very, like, has substances in it which are actually maybe more harmful than the solid particles. We don't know enough, but we have the right to know what's in our products and whether it's harmful for us and the environment or not. And at the moment, that's not covered, and it might not be as well covered as we want it to be. So that's something that I'm very worried about, that, we still won't really know what it does to us in our environment.
And could even be misleading the consumer, as you say, as well. And Hans-Peter, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's like the phrase day to day is a bit difficult for me, because sometimes a lot of these effects we don't see at the day to day level. But I mean, they would be like maybe on the year to year level, we'd see things. And I think the concern Bentelise raised is good, that if we don't do this properly and we have a narrow definition, we could make a space for something as equally as problematic to take the place of what we're looking at. So we do have to be definitely holistic, but and we have to avoid greenwashing, and we have to be a bit upfront about how much we really know about what's in our products. So we just can't say, oh, we did some toxicity tests, they're fine, don't worry about them. No, it's just like, if you don't know everything, you don't know everything, and you have to kind of admit that. But the long-term things I'm worried is like what persistent polymers we're putting out there, whether they're microplastics by the ECHA definition or soluble polymers or whatever, because we're seeing these accumulate in the remote ocean and the deep in the water column. We're seeing them accumulate in the soils. We're seeing them even start to accumulate in the body, and we don't know what the long-term consequences are. We just know that if they're persistent, they're not reversible. Like, there's going to be there forever. It's like slowly releasing the things from Pandora's box, and you can't put them in the box, and they're just accumulating, and then there's nothing you can do. So this is what we have to realize, what we could be doing, and what we have to prevent now to prevent irreversible effects in future. And just to tie into that, when I say irreversible effects, people think of climate change and overproduction of overuse of oil and gas, but these things are all correlated, because it's all about, we're taking too much of a thing that was not introduced onto the earth to something that's non-biodegradable on the earth, and so we're just accumulating the different novel entities. And so all of these threats that we're faced with, increased plastic and carbon emissions, they're all related. So I think so we can't decouple that. We just have to be a bit more cautious that we're not making permanent changes to the planet and everything we do.
And David, what are your specific worries in relation to the marine environment?
As I said earlier about uncertainty and so on, and I fully endorse what Hans has just said, that it's too risky to be continuing like this, particularly as we're revealing evidence that there is long-term damage and there's things happening to the environment which perhaps we through lack of knowledge and scientific research stuff we didn't know that much about. So in that sense, we're discovering it, but it's too worrying, I think, to continue, particularly visibly. Plastic litter is the majority of the litter that's on beaches, and it ends up in the marine environment, or it's moved around on a much larger scale than we ever anticipated, but it's where it ends up and what happens to it in other locations, in situ, in deep water, where it finds itself ending up in the food chain and so on, which we've mentioned and so on. I think this is good enough reason that, personally, I think there should be a ban on continued use of many plastics if they're not deemed to be safe. And I think whatever we do to the environment is probably not safe to some extent, but we obviously want to reduce that impact. But the very fact that it is sort of damaging so much of the environment is really a good reason to look towards a much more severe treatment of how plastics are actually used in society, whether it improves through awareness raising or education, flagging it up to people. We need to start from a baseline, I think, at some point, to begin to remove this plastic out of the environment, and in so doing, you are going to reduce the amount of damage to the environment long term, where plastics are degrading and leading on to further problems. So for me personally, I think, do we actually need so much plastic? And I think we really need to address it. It's a serious issue, far more serious than we ever envisioned. And we need to just move away from it, I think, and find alternatives.
Thank you. And would anyone else like to come in on this one just before we open up the floor to the audience?
Yeah, if I can say a final word on this restriction, it's not just about this restriction. Actually, as you may know, the Commission has made commitments in the context of the chemical strategy for sustainability and the restriction roadmap, which was recently published. And so when you see that, it's a great commitment, but how can we trust that commitment when we see what is ongoing with the microplastics? So I think this is also a really good precedent, and we have to make it a good precedent. So yeah, I just wanted to put a bit of a broader background and context into this microplastic restriction. It's really anchored into a much broader political project, and we need to push the Commission to be consistent on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hélène. If no one has anything else to add, I think we will move to the questions from the audience. Thank you so much to all the panelists for your contributions so far. We've got quite a few questions going in the Q&A, and I think people have been upvoting which ones they like best. So I'm just going to choose a few. Please let me know if you'd like to come in and answer those. So relating to your point about consumers, Bentelise, we do have one question saying, it's from Franziska Nulst. She says, how can we reach out to consumers to make them aware of what they buy? For example, warnings on packaging, saying it contains microplastics, or addressing the shops to warn customers. How can we help consumers choose plastic-free alternatives?
Obviously, you can put it on the packaging, but I don't know how many industry will put it on their packaging, like there's plastic inside warning. I mean, you could regulate that, but as maybe most of you know, we have an app called Beta Microbeat app, and you can scan your products with this app, and then it'll tell you, so you just scan the ingredients, and then it'll tell you whether there's plastic inside or not. Yeah, in that way you can make a bit of a better decision. So that is one way to do it. I don't know if Hans has anything to add to this.
Well, I'll just add. I mean, it's not. I'm working with an NGO called ChemSec, and they have a movement called the Ban PFAS movement. And what that's also, it's another way around to do it for companies to get involved, and that's the companies to show that they're committed to for instance, phasing out microplastics or PFAS from their products, because a lot of the times they don't even know, because they might be just shopping things, materials, and they don't know if it contains PFAS or at least microplastics, but they can at least show that they're committed, and then at least consumers can make choices based on companies that are showing a genuine interest in being committed to do something about the problem, because it is a difficult problem in a lot of cases. Yeah.
Thank you. And we have quite a few people asking for some clarity on what exactly are the alternatives available as opposed to synthetic polymers. Can anyone address that one?
Well, there you have to look at the use. It's different, and sometimes it's not a simple question of what can we use to replace, I don't know, polyethylene. You have to look at the specific use. And I mean, we talked about exfoliants. I mean, you can use crushed walnuts. You can use algae, hardened algae, or anything there's a lot of naturally known biodegradable things we could replace this with. And it's very also, and that's where the whole topic of essential use comes in. First question A, do we actually need this? Yes or no? And B, if we need it, is there anything that's environmentally benign we can replace it with? And I think quite often in cosmetics, the answer is yes, it just costs more. So we might have to be willing to pay a little bit more to have it more environmentally safely. Or, I mean, we can also talk about how cosmetics are priced, but we'll save that for another day.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to jump in on that one? No. And moving on, we have one question that proposes, would it be a good approach to simply actually ban non-essential products in cosmetics as an approach to legal regulation? He says, yeah, would that be an interesting policy for reducing microplastics?
This is, if I may comment, this is the restriction is essentially banning, and it's not about saying that we don't want exfoliant. It's about restricting a certain ingredients, because the restriction works on the basis of REACH, the European regulation on chemicals. So you don't actually ban a cream, but a certain chemical that's an ingredient there. And that's where the challenge with the microplastics restriction is that we have indeed a situation where certain intentionally added microplastics are simply too small for the authorities to detect, which, yeah, it is as ridiculous as it sounds. But that seems to be according to the information I got from the reality, and I don't have a reason to think otherwise. And this is then hard to enforce, because you cannot check whether the company is doing it or not. And it's a question whether it makes sense to, restrict something that you cannot check whether it's happening or not. So I think that this is where we need to tackle this particular problem, but we still should move ahead with the restriction in, a normal human language, banning microplastics. Restriction is essentially a ban, and I think that's just a language question in this respect.
Thanks for that, Martin. And we've also had a couple of questions relating to microplastics being added to other products that we haven't talked about today, such as cigarettes and even car tires. So we have a few people asking, why is it that we're not focusing on them, and why are we focusing so much on cosmetics?
Well, I think car tires is an interesting example, because that's not there's not microplastics added to it. What happens is when we drive the cars, the bits of rubber and plastic come off and then enter the environment. And so that's what we also call the secondary microplastics. So it's much easier to ban primary microplastic, as Martin mentioned, and we should do that. But the secondary microplastics, then it's about material quality standards. So we can look at different tires. I mean, like a way to deal with something like that is to look at different rubber technologies and see what are emitting the most or emitting the least. And if they're emitting, what's the toxicity of those particles? Because there's a lot of crazy chemistry in these car tires, I can tell you. So we can look at we have to do testing of what is the environmental release and toxicity of the particles different tires release. So it's an issue we can address. It's just a different strategy than the primary microplastics.
Yeah, if I can add to that, the European Commission is at the moment looking into policy measures for unintentional release. So the secondary microplastics, so they're also covering tires, but also textiles, paints, and yeah, some others. This is obviously very important as well. But I am a little bit worried, as what Hélène also mentioned before, that they are planning on coming out with something at the end of the year. But this seems like I almost can't believe that there will be a restriction or something at the end of this year now, because this restriction has been postponed for so long. So it would be really good if this will also be there at the end of the year, because obviously this is also very important sources that need to be addressed. Yeah, that's my hope, but obviously that's also very important. But here we are so far already with intentional edit. This is intentional edit, so you can also leave it out. It's a choice, was that what Hélène said, and it is definitely, yeah, it seems to be much easier in a way to regulate because you actually put it in something. So yeah.
Hélène, did you want to come in there?
Yes, quickly if possible, Maeve. Just to say what Bentelise, like just to complement, you may know that in the restriction proposal, there are transitional periods for all these sectors from 5 to 8 years, starting from the entry into force of the restriction. And yeah, the restriction now has been discussed for the past 3 years. It's still not, there is still no proposal, there is still no adoption, there's still no entry into force. So what we are doing now is actually giving kind of an implicit transition period already, which is already a signal to industry that they can change their practice. So it's quite disappointing. This whole process is quite frustrating because every year of delay, every year of more discussion is more emissions into the environment and more time for industry to continue while they could already start working on substitution. So just wanted to highlight that because I think we didn't really mention this transitional periods, which are de facto derogations for some of the uses.
Thanks for highlighting that, Hélène. I'm wondering whether we have time for one last question. If anyone can very quickly sum up, we just have a question about wastewater treatment technologies. Can anyone speak about kind of the filtering processes and whether we could get better at that?
Well, most wastewater technologies are very good at filtering micro and nanoplastics, but then the question is what happens after that? In some cases, these are used as fertilizers, so then they enter the soil terrestrial ecosystem and then can also spread from there. So they're very good at protecting wastewater, but what they do with sludge is a management issue. And I'm pro recycling of sludge. I think we need phosphorus nitrogen. I don't want to burn it all, but I prefer less microplastic in my sludge and other contaminants. Yeah.
Thank you. That was very clear. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we're going to have to bring the webinar to a close now. But thank you so much again to all the panelists and for all the audience for attending and for all your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. But thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.